Okay, good morning, my beautiful people. Thank you for attending this breakout section that is featuring intersectional feminism. And to my right, we have Hypatia Alexandria, who is badass. When I did my first introduction, what conference were we at?
The one in Atlanta.
Yeah, and someone had upset her.
Yes.
Someone offended her rightly. Her righteous anger I became a fan of hers ever since then because it was like looking at a Latin version of myself. Because a lot of us feel when we're in certain areas, you can't be angry because we don't want to be that angry black woman or that angry Latina or that angry queer. And I'm pro-anger, especially if it's righteous. And so she became my shero. I went home. I was talking on the phone with Mandisa, who was at the airline, at the air gate. The gate.
Oh, American Atheist. That's what it was. Yes, and it was
Oh,
that area.
Man, she
that
was
area.
hot.
That area. Yes.
Because the people that we encounter like to put us in our place as racial minorities, as social minorities. You come across the majority who like to bring us down a peg or two. And in our pride and in our knowledge, we like to match them and bring them down a peg or three. So I was able to witness this awesome woman and her righteous indignance. Oh, fuck you. So I basically I've been a stand ever since. So enough about that. Hypatia represents the Hispanic American freethinkers and has been active in the North Virginia community for the past 30 years. She currently serves as a member of the Hispanic Business and Technology Council Board, and she assists young Hispanics in advancing their education and preparing them to be active participants in their careers and communities. I should have known that because you're so passionate. In 2006, Hypatia founded the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of North Virginia, whose goal is to connect Hispanic and non-Hispanic businesses. So everyone, this is Hypatia, one of your panel members. Next is Deanna. And Deanna and I have met today. This is our first time meeting at this event, but we've been Facebook friends for years, and man, is she vocal. Like she would drag you in a nice professional way. But she's an awesome blogger, just a prolific, profound wordsmith. So when she accepted our invitation to participate, I was greatly looking forward to it because between her dimples, her words, I just knew I was going to have an awesome time when I met her. And I did. So a little bit about Deanna. Deanna Adams is a multifaceted black atheist woman who has many irons in the proverbial fire. Her essay, Black Women and Christianity Part 2, is featured in Women vs. Religion, The Case Against Faith and for Freedom, edited by Karen Garst. After going through deconversion by leaving an abusive marriage and the church, she created the blog Musings on a Limb, where she expresses her views as an African-American, atheist, and professional mom on subjects related to the intersectionality of racism and skepticism. Deanna has also served as a board member of Houston area Black Nonbelievers and the Humanists of Houston. So I'm introducing your panel member, Deanna Adams. And last, but certainly not least, my babe, Heina. Oh, when I met Heina, I was like, man, they're so awesome and so young. And I think being a part of this, I got into this community older, and I had a lot of anger because I felt like I should have been woke like a lot of these young people, and I just wasted all this time chasing God, Jehovah, and to come into this group, this organization, and see these amazing, vocal young people kind of shine a mirror upon me and what I didn't do or couldn't do because I didn't have the knowledge. So you kind of just glean and just learn. which is what I've done with Heina. And I met Heina, we've known each other for several years. So a little bit about Heina. Heina Dadabhoy spent their childhood as a practicing Muslim who never envisioned that they will grow up to be an atheist, feminist, secular humanist. Heina has been an active participant in atheist organizations and events in and around Orange County, California since 2007. Since 2011, they have been a speaker on the national stage on a range of diverse topics, including feminism, race, LGBT issues, the challenges of deconversion, Islam, non-monogamy, and strategies for inclusivity. You may have heard them at Skepticon, Huffington Post Live, and Have Your Say on the BBC World Service, or read about them in the New York Times. So as you can see, Heina gets around. So without further ado, I'm going to present to you the panel on intersectionality and feminism. I'm not sure if there are questions. I wasn't given any questions.
Okay.
So.
All right, well, I guess I'll be the lucky one. I'll start. My name is Hypatia Alexandria, and I'm a PhD student in Virginia Tech, and my field is transportation, which sounds a little bit boring, but transportation is a tool that can be used to segregate and oppress people. Okay? Now, we can go into an entire conversation here or how, why, but I'll give a very quick explanation. If you set up communities according to zoning, which is another tool to segregate people, that was the core reason why zoning was created to start with. You know, you put certain groups of people in certain areas, and then you take transportation away from them, and what do you have? An isolated community. So that's why transportation can be a very effective tool to do such a thing. Today I'm here to talk about intersectionality between many things, but I want to focus on education mainly, because in education you find so many different ways to oppress people of color, particularly women. For example, today in most of my classes I can find, if I'm lucky, one Latina, a couple of black students, and that's about it. So, you know, you can be very effective in keeping the status quo through education. And on top of that, you add another layer of screening very carefully who you are admitting, and that you end up with a very selective group of your own as a university. So, I'm not going to tell anybody here what they should believe or anything like that, but I just want you to think from my point of view what I'm seeing in education. I'm studying pedagogy right now because I've decided that teaching is a good way to give minorities, especially particularly women, because that's where my passion is with women. They are so, especially Latinas, they are enslaved, they are invisible, they've been abused, and this was done from the conquistadors' time, so it's something embedded in our DNA. This is not something that has been taught in yesterday's class or started yesterday in college or education. It's been since day one, and it's been so effective that most Latinas don't even know that that's happened to them. So, I decided to go into to prepare myself to teach so I can be somebody in the classroom that students like me can relate to. And we were discussing the subject of diversity and inclusion. And the question was like, well, why are you taking this class? Well, I'm taking this class because when you ask, where are the Latino students? Where are the Latino potential faculty? We've called everybody, we've looked everywhere, and we cannot see them. Well, I'm right here in front of you. Can you see me? I'm even in your class. How can you not see me? So, that to me, that was like, oh my gosh, another wake-up call, one after the other, racism, ageism, gender, everything. And we see that in education, in our universities, where it's supposed to be a place to learn, to be tolerant, to discuss differences in a safe environment. And I don't mean a safe environment where if I tell you something, you're going to be offended, because if that's the case, that's the door. There are things that are going to offend, and I don't even like the word. There are things that are going to insult people one way or another. No matter what anyone says, it's going to have unintended consequences for another group. So my advice, when you're being invisible, when you're being oppressed, when you're being enslaved mentally, is to just come out and say it, and then deal with the consequences, whether they're intended or unintended, as opposed to not talk about anything and pretend that everything is perfect. And there is acceptance of you in spite of not belonging to this group or that group. And so, that's what took me, that's what piqued my interest in education. Also, I wanted to mention quickly that the intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which was a critical race scholar and legal theorist. And she did that to address the connection between dimensions of oppression that shape lived experience. Which takes me to another point. A lot of the time they say, well, why do you want diversity in the classroom? Well, you want diversity in the classroom because you want that student coming into as a freshman to look up and see somebody that looks like them, that might have certain points, some commonality, and they will feel inspired to move ahead and keep studying and keep being productive in their communities. But sometimes the word culture is another word that I don't protect. I think culture should be questioned, should be criticized, and it doesn't get a free pass just because it's my culture. So, what? I cannot do anything that my culture does? That's not me. I have black in me, I have Jewish in me, I have white in me, not because I say so, science says so. So, I try to enjoy every background that I have in me, and I try to get the good things, because all ideas have a positive side and a negative side, and it's up to each person to pick the good things about it, rather than saying, well, it's bad, so, I hate that. So I try to do that. It's not easy. I'm a human being. I don't like to be criticized. It's difficult for me to deal with criticism, but you have to take it, and you have to accept that that's something that is going to happen when you are trying to get your point across, and when you are trying to work with your community, and when you're trying to make young girls be interested and change their future. My fight has been in the Latino community for forever, since I can remember. I'm always looking for a way to make sure that they belong in STEM classes, that they participate in the community, that they are involved, that the things that the Hispanic cultures that I don't agree with, and that they make the Hispanic community kind of invisible and self-destructive at times, it's forgotten or it's corrected. I've been involved in that fight, forever, and it's not easy. One question that I want to ask: How many people here are Latino, Hispanic, or considered? Okay, one. That's one more than 16 years ago. So we are making progress, but as you can see, it's not a lot of progress. Okay. So how long do I have?
Well, we're going to pass the mic.
Okay. All right.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Bring it. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So, just so you guys know how panels are here, we each are going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. So when I was asked about my views on feminism, or whenever I'm asked about my views on feminism, I always feel a little weird, for lack of a better term, because I've generally not felt fully, I don't know why I'm not looking at this, let me just say. So I've generally not felt fully included in white feminism, because the issues that many white women champion stop really short of the things that matter most to me as a Black woman who is focused on uplifting Black women and helping us break free from oppression. This is slowly changing with the acknowledgement that intersectional feminism is key to us all moving forward towards equity, which is refreshing. The top issues facing Black women, in my view, which is definitely not an exhaustive list, but it's kind of how I look at things, are domestic violence, reproductive justice, education / the school to prison pipeline, and health disparities in our community. While obviously this is an exhaustive list, like I just said, these are the areas that I choose to focus on. A lot of times because these are the areas that have touched me personally, or my children, or my family, or people in my community in Houston, from Houston, Texas, by the way. H-Town. So Black women being preyed on by the church either causes or exacerbates all these issues as far as I'm concerned. And that's kind of where that intersection between skepticism and specifically Black women issues happens for me. So it's worth noting at this point that I do try to speak and write about Black women's relationships with the church and the Christian church specifically with compassion and understanding of how we were burdened with this belief system in the first place. On every podcast I've been privileged to speak on, especially if it's a white podcaster's show, I make sure to explain why being mean about these beliefs isn't usually helpful. Calling the beliefs dumb, and lately, it's the word that I see going around, cooning and stuff like that. It just shows a lack of historical understanding, and it really simplifies the issue. We didn't become one of the most religious communities out of nowhere, kind of eaten into us in some instances. So, for the most part, this wasn't a choice in the Black community, and giving it up represents a hopeless alternative to many people. If you take away Christianity, then what do I still have? I'm still being oppressed. I'm still, in the situation that I'm in. So that's why it's imperative for the secular community to offer alternatives and not just ridicule. How can I hear this all the time, and especially when I'm on podcasts? How can Black people be Christian? That's so stupid. You kind of need to, and this is why I'm so glad we're here today, surrounded by other Black women, because that's just annoying. Don't do that anymore. Stop it, white people. Now that I get that off my chest. Getting back to the feminist issues that need to be addressed better by the secular community, domestic violence tops the list for me as a domestic violence survivor. In 2011, which is the year that I left an abusive spouse and church on the same day, Black women were murdered at a rate of 2.5 times higher than white women. 94% of them knew their killers. The church, in many cases, including mine, would just have wives pray for their husbands, hope that it gets better. You keep being the best wife you can possibly be, and God will change them, kind of thing. And that rarely works out well, obviously. So Black women, especially in my home state of Texas, are also far more likely to die in childbirth than white women, regardless of class. While the church isn't directly implicated in this phenomenon, I say with a wink, racism at all levels is, perhaps if the Christian church didn't push being fruitful and multiplying and vehemently oppose abortion, less women would be in this situation to begin with. So despite Black women achieving the highest rates of post-secondary education in the Black community, between 2004 and 2014, Black women's real median annual earnings declined by 5%. Declined by 5%, which was more than 3 times as much as women's earnings overall. And side note, a lot of these stats that I'm quoting are cited in the book, in the chapter, so you can go back and look at that. Couple this with Black women's participation rates in churches that demand their money, and the financial picture is very bleak. So you're making less, and you're the biggest portion of the church that's telling you to give 10% of that gross, and sow a seed on top of it, and they're just killing us financially and in every other way. Before we can even get to this point, however, we have to contend with racist education policies in the school-to-prison pipeline, which, yes, affects Black girls as well. In this area, the church continues to be harmful by promoting antiquated disciplinary strategies like spanking instead of proven technologies to quell misbehavior, and more importantly, because this is not all because of misbehavior, fighting against racist school systems to begin with. Across the nation, oops, sorry, I was stupid. No, I didn't. Anyway, that's for our children's future. Finally, and by no means the last issue, health disparities plague Black women despite 84% reporting religion as being very important to us and 59% saying they attend church at least once a week. Higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease suggest this religiosity is not exactly working as suggested. So, you know, it's like we're in the church the most, but we're also having the most problems. Something's not working. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, my face, I can't hide it. I definitely think the secular community can do a much better job of addressing these issues, especially if we want Black women to leave the church in favor of non-belief. To be sure, a secular approach would naturally be better suited to tackle these intersectional feminist issues than traditional Christianity, but we first have to put programs in place to help those who have only known to run to God with their problems. And Sakiba mentioned this last night, and I was like, I'm gonna say that tomorrow. But, you know, once we do this, once we have alternatives to Christianity and alternatives to run to God and run to church, I think it will be easier for us to say, you know, you don't have to continue in this life where you are being actively harmed. So, you know, then we can help even more women escape the bonds of oppression, both at church and at home. Thank you.
Hello. So what I wanted to address today and sort of take this platform to address is the ways that sort of my journey with intersectionality as a term and as a concept mirrors, I think, something that happens a lot with people who come at it from a different perspective than that of a Black perspective. And if you get it through the lens of white feminism to start, sometimes it can get a little muddled. And so I figured I would offer that and sort of where I come from in that. So I sort of started out with sort of, I grew up in the girl power 90s, and so, you know, anything you can do, I can do better mentality. And so when I heard of feminism, I'm like, yeah, that sounds right, but you know, I don't want to be an extreme feminist, oh no. You know, I don't want to burn any bras or anything, and then, you know, of course now I'm, you know, left of left. Yeah, now I'm the person people say they don't want to be like, because then they'll be too extreme. It's fun how that happens. But for me personally, like my encounters with it lately, the sort of the term intersectional, when it's used by people who are often not coming from good grounding in theory and good grounding in practice even, is you get people calling people intersectional to mean that they're multiply marginalized. Which is such a ridiculous thing to say. Like, people will say to me, oh, you're an intersectional person. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? And what they mean is, I can be their token on multiple issues. You know, if they need a speaker who checks all the boxes, transmasculine, check, queer, check, brown, check, atheist, check, ex-Muslim, check. You know, they're like, all right, we just need this one speaker, and everyone else can be straight white men and we'll be fine. So that's where you get sort of the buzzword of it, and that's where you get people not really understanding where it comes from. Like, what, you can't call an individual person an intersectional person. That's not a thing. Intersectionality, you know, it's a practice, it's an understanding, it's a grounding. That's what it is. And so that's something that I've fallen into personally myself. Just because when I heard about it, it sounded good, just like with feminism. I was like, oh, this sounds good, maybe I can, you know, sort of figure out what it is. And then I had to really go back and, like, you know, to use a very bad analogy, have my come to Jesus moment. So when I think about intersectionality lately, I think of it more as the practice of inclusion, the practice of accommodation, the practice of ensuring that there are platforms and spaces. And actually, that's why I've been a bit adamant about everybody using the mic right now. Because one of the things I think about a lot is accessibility, and for people with auditory processing issues or any other, auditory issues, I used to be the person who said, oh, my voice is super loud, I'll just project. And that's really, really bad. And we have to be really mindful that that's not going to work for everybody. And to sort of go to my own background as an ex-Muslim, I think a lot about the criticism of Islam. And so this came up at Sadia's talk just now for the keynote that just happened. The question that came up at the end, of course, was there are people who are criticizing Islam from sort of the wrong perspective or with the wrong intentions. And how do we sort of parse that out? And so I think about it as sort of there's two facets of it, and they seem sort of obvious when you say it, but there's where you're coming from and where you're going when it comes to criticism of Islam specifically, and from an intersectional perspective. Where you're coming from matters in the sense of, if you are literally a 1488 white supremacist and you're criticizing Islam, even if you're making decent arguments, I'm probably not going to take you very seriously, probably not promote what you're saying, unless I get tricked, which has happened, by the way. When I first was an ex-Muslim, I sort of accepted any attention I could get, and I went on a podcast, and it turned out, partway through I realized, oh, these people are trying to get me to say, yes, we should expel all Muslims from all Western countries. And it's no, I'm not going to say that. It has happened since with people who are now not as much of a thing in the secular community, but, I went on a podcast once where it seemed like the guy was just trying to get me to give him a criticize all Muslims free card. He basically wanted me to say that it's a good idea to go up to random Muslims in the street, and by Muslims he means women in a headscarf, and say things like Muhammad was a pedophile, because to him this was shocking and would get them to challenge their ideas. And I sat there thinking, you don't know what a woman in a headscarf's life is. You don't know what she's going through. There was a period of my life where I was wearing a headscarf and I was a flaming atheist. I just didn't have any outlet. I didn't know what to do with my life. I was still living with my parents. So, you don't really know where that person's coming from. And really, when has anyone ever deconverted because some white guy yelled that Muhammad was a pedophile? Literally, sounds fake, never happened. What really did get me to question my religion, though, was people in my life who I knew where they were coming from. So I had a lot of non-Muslim friends in high school, because the Muslims in my high school were actually really cruel to me, because I was a really sincere person, and I always have been, and that makes you a victim in a lot of ways. But I had a lot of friends who were, good people from non-Muslim backgrounds. That alone made me question Islam, That alone, just knowing that there were people who were nice, good people. I'm like, how can these people go to hell? This is awful. And then when 9/11 happened, which by the way was my second day of high school, so that really colored my experience, I had people coming up to me saying, we know you're a good person, we know your religion is of peace, but where are these hijackers coming from? And so that made me go and examine Islam, and then at the end of it, I came out an atheist. So, just thinking about where people are coming from, it matters. So when they make criticisms or ask questions, if they're coming from a different sort of place, you tend to interpret that differently. And the other question, of course, is where you're going. Why are you criticizing Islam? Is it so that Christianity can look better? Because there are certainly people doing that. And I, as I've become more savvy, I did accept going on some Christian's radio show, his talk show online. And, he was trying to get me to criticize Islam in such a way that made Christianity sound good. And he and his audience were very annoyed when I kept saying, Christianity has that too. It's no different. It's just y'all don't practice what's in your book. You just ignore half of it. They really did not like that. But that's sort of the idea. It's where are you going with this criticism? Are you trying to help people who are in Islam question Islam? Are you trying to, like Sally was talking about, criticize Islam in the means of saving people? Well, not saving, actually, we don't want to give people a white savior complex here. In the sort of helping give them resources and access to escape when they need it. Or are you just doing it to sort of, seem cool and edgy and, offend people for its own sake? Which I guess there's room for, but it's a lot less room than people think it is, in my humble opinion. So when we talk about culture too, like you mentioned with culture, I think of culture as something that people use sometimes, especially well-intentioned white people, as an excuse, as something to honor above all others. Like when I was in college, I went to UC Irvine, which is Derrida was there for a while, and if you know anything about Derrida. His influence has not died. His zombie lives on in the undergrads who gravely informed me that although my terrible experiences as an apostate with my family were certainly sad, I needed to respect my family's culture. And I remember looking at them saying, okay, so your white cultures are allowed to evolve. They're allowed to change. They're allowed to progress. They're allowed to, but brown cultures, we need to preserve them in amber, in the Stone Age. And so you guys can gawk at them like they're a cultural oddity. It's really insulting. It really is. And, so that's what people think of as sort of leftists on campus. Like that's what they're talking about, is these sort of really naive multiculturalist ideals that, again, it comes from a place of naivete often, or sometimes because they just don't want to see what's in front of them. But I think of understanding culture as important in the sense of you need to understand where someone's coming from. There's a reason why people, a lot of times people of color have trouble finding good therapists. It's not because there aren't nice white therapists who are going to say, oh yes, that's your family's culture. They exist, they're everywhere. I've had to fire at least a dozen of them before finding my therapist. But what you don't have is a true understanding. Is people who understand what it's like coming from communities of color, which often place less emphasis on the individual than white cultural communities. And I'm using white very broadly here, because one of my best therapists was Greek. She came from a culture that, was like mine, where, family matters and the individual matters a little bit less, perhaps. But I think of it as understanding the background of a person, but not dictating where they're allowed to go. Not trying to tell them how they can move forward. And so it comes back to this concept of intersectionality as the idea that you can't separate someone's identities. And this comes up a lot in atheist circles where people say, well, atheism isn't necessarily feminist. And for me, that's just, I laugh at that, because to me, feminism had a lot to do with why I'm an atheist. I can't separate the theological reasons why I left Islam from the feminist reasons. To me, they're one and the same. For me, it came down to me questioning religion. And yes, there are things about religion that don't make sense from a logical or rational perspective outside of gender, but the gender aspect certainly didn't hurt. And I joke all the time that, if I had been assigned male at birth, if I'd been a boy, raised that way, I might have stuck around in Islam because it would have been to my benefit. I don't think so highly of myself that I think that, I would never do anything for my own benefit. Don't be shy.
Question for you. I have a Pakistani co-worker. She's Muslim, of course. Well, not of course, but we have a lot of those conversations, and we touch on those points a little bit, and she'll ask me, because generally a lot of people think that black women go to church. It's just what we do. So she asked me about what church do I go to, or like if my kids and I celebrate Christmas or do. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm kind of not really, because I don't want to say that at work, not at the place that I work. And you can tell that when she speaks to me about things in her culture and how her family treats her, her mom is trying to make her get married and make her feel that, you can tell like she could be on the tipping point of just, what do I do? What should be my part in that?
So to repeat the question, what do you do with someone who, say, is from a Pakistani Muslim background, and they seem like they're on the tipping point, they're talking about their background, but you don't necessarily come from that same background, and what can you do to sort of help them? I personally, playing the philosophy major, I like the Socratic method a little bit, where you ask questions instead of making statements, or you sort of say, oh, well, or present your own perspective and say, like, how is it for you? So actually, I can think of examples from my own life where, like when I was in high school and I had non-Muslim friends, the things that they said were, people who were close to me, who I knew were in good faith, and who would say things like, Like, for example, I remember once, this blew my mind, one of my colleagues, back then it was classmates, right, in high school, she said, some of the, I've heard some Islamic extremists use quotes from the Quran, but your Quran's different, right? And even though it was a statement of ignorance, I'm like, no, there's just one Quran, bro. But like, it came from a place of ignorance, but it made me think, from a Christian perspective, they do have different editions and versions of the Bible. And then there's the fan fiction called the Book of Mormon. Like, there's, they have all that. And so I had to sort of reconsider my perspective. And then I found out, as it turns out, there are different translations of the Quran, and different ones focus on different things. And what blew my mind was I found out there's a legit Saudi conspiracy. Like the mosques in the US, the ones that don't have a lot of funding, sometimes mysterious Saudi donors will show up and be like, we'll provide you with all these translations and all these texts. Turns out they're Wahhabi, Salafist, focused translations. I had no idea, but had it not been for my good friend who was coming from a good perspective, trying to sort of make an analogy to her own background, I would have never found any of that out. And as a Muslim, I was more outraged by it then than I am now. Now I'm like, well, of course. But back then I was like, how dare they? How dare they take the pure Quran and sully it with their nasty Wahhabist ideas? So just, even relating, so the point of all that was related to your perspective is fine. If you make a statement out of ignorance, it's from a good place, at least, that might cause someone to consider. And be there for them. Let them know that, you're here for them as like an emotional resource. You're probably the safest sounding board for her. That's probably what it comes down to.
She's every day.
She probably has no one else to turn to. So you're kind of that safe opening, and if you're willing to be that, be there for her, because it is tough. It is tough going out there.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap the panel part up and dedicate the remaining 13 minutes to questions because we have a focus group at 11:30. So I hope everyone was able to glean and learn because they packed a punch in a short time frame. So I want to thank every one of you for the informative dialogue. I didn't even think about, even though I know as a Black person about transportation, when you elaborated on it, I'm like, cabs in New York, in the hood, how hard it is to catch the bus. And to know that
intentional, it's not a coincidence.
how the red lining, how you are actively working to make a difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, and also Deanna, I'm with you on that question from white people. White people, before you come to us about our people going to church, Joel Osteen church is full of white people. Okay? You go to your white people and you ask them, why are they going to church? Knowing the history that where you beat and killed our folk, if they didn't believe, you ask them why are they still going to church before you come to us Black folk, okay? Because I'm not going to be nice when you come to me. Go to your people and ask them why they still going to church, knowing the history and the abuse that was heaped upon our ancestors if we didn't believe Christianity. Okay, I just want to get that straight. I'm known as a drag queen. I will drag you to the depths of hell for disrespecting my believing family. I will. Okay.
I have a question for Deanna. So, as you may have heard, maybe recently with what Serena Williams went through during her childbirth, that she kind of highlighted her experiences, and it seems that now some bit of attention is being placed on Black women, especially the high mortality rates that they're experiencing in childbirth. Even Elizabeth Warren has even mentioned it in one of her stump speeches. So what do you think we can do in terms of the Black community to really sort of elevate the health disparities as, maybe through education, because if this didn't happen to Serena, right, perhaps maybe nationally we would not have known the extent of how this is happening in terms of medical racism that exists in different medical institutions.
Awesome, thank you. So to reiterate, Serena Williams has had a very public acknowledgement of the racism that she experienced when having her daughter. She almost died because she knew her body. She was having blood clots. She had had them before. The doctors wouldn't listen. They were like, no, you're fine. You just had a baby. And if she hadn't pushed back, she could have died. This happens a lot, unfortunately, in the community. Even before her, there were other, I mean, there's tons of stories like that, but her story is one of the most, seen out there. And so the question was, how can we elevate that issue and kind of help it? So one of the ways, or one of the first ways we can always help and elevate things is to talk about it. To talk about it as much as possible. Medical apartheid, which is basically what this is, has been around for lots and lots of years. The book, Medical Apartheid, I suggested, look it up, skim it, just read kind of the summary and it'll tell you a lot. But that goes into how, excuse me, a lot of ways that racism rears its head in the medical field. Black people in general are perceived to have less pain. So when we say we're in pain, we're looked at as being drug seekers. We're clearly, we don't hurt as much as fragile white people, clearly. And so, that's a big part of it. And then specifically about maternal mortality, I think it's interesting that modern gynecology was basically learned on Black bodies with no anesthesia. Again, medical apartheid, you can learn all about that. So part of it is learning about the history. This is not a new phenomenon at all, but we definitely need to elevate those voices. It's, I'm sad that happened to Serena Williams specifically, but it's great that she was vocal about it, that she is vocal about it, because now more people are talking about it. And I think now that we know that this has happened to a famous person with all the money in the world, we can start talking about the everyday people that it happens to, like I said, every day. And, with abortion access rolling back in a lot of states, with the setup for the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade and all the things we're going to continually see that with money being taken away from Planned Parenthood. So if you see any of those things, if you can be involved in the fight to preserve Planned Parenthood, preserve abortion access, preserve reproductive rights, generally, please do that. Please speak up. Please, find those resources in your community that you can get involved with to kind of elevate this issue. Thank you for the question.
I would like to piggyback on the medical apartheid. I've read the book by Washington. It's excellent. And she has videos on YouTube as well. But I work in the health field and work with a lot of doctors as well. And it's sort of taught that Black people, or I don't like to use the word people of color or whatever, but Black people or brown people, they don't get the treatment. So in my aspect is that we need to start holding accountable the healthcare professions. The only reason why that people of color or Black people aren't affected by the opioid crisis is because doctors thought that Black folks was going and use the drugs, so we didn't get it, so it didn't affect us. And that's not something that I made up, and this is what the professionals are saying. But we need to start holding our doctors accountable as far as the way they treat us. I work with Medicare as well, and an insurance aspect with I have over 500 clients. And when I work in the Black neighborhoods, when they go to the doctor, they don't get the care, or they may need it. They may need an MRI, but they're going to get an X-ray, although the insurance company will pay for it, or they're just popping out pills. It's just a pill mill for a lot of them. And I've had to take my clients to the doctor and literally just go off into place about what they're doing. So we need to hold them accountable, especially for the seniors who are not vocal, and a lot of seniors and a lot of people just think doctors are gods.
Right. So one of the best things that I've seen on Facebook or Twitter, one of those places, was someone suggested that when we as Black women or anyone who is not being treated properly by a medical professional feel that we're not being treated properly, ask them the simple thing of, okay, so are you refusing to treat me for this? Can you please document that in my notes? That simple request, document it, document everything. And sometimes it'll turn around. Sometimes it won't, but at least if it doesn't, you have that documentation that they refuse to fully treat you. That's one for self-advocacy. The other thing I was thinking when you were speaking was, I may have lost it already, sorry. But documenting the other thing is, so in my former profession, I was a pharmaceutical rep. Doctors are not gods. They don't know everything.
Right.
I was shocked. I was in that industry for 12 years, recently laid off. I was shocked as a first-year rep going into an office and explaining to a doctor about the drug that I had studied for about 3 weeks to 6 weeks, actually 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the company, and explaining to them how this drug worked, what pathways it worked in, being more of an expert on that chemical than that doctor was, and them listening to me and believing me. Now, of course, I was telling the truth. I was telling, what I had studied or trained on, what have you. But it was shocking to me just to go in and say, this is a doctor that's been studying for 10 years at least, and I'm telling them something that they're looking at me like, oh, you're very knowledgeable about your product. Yeah, but you're a doctor.
But they only require you to do 8 hours of pharmacology, so.
Exactly. So that's when I learned that medicine really is an art. It is not a science. Most doctors, I gotta go. Most doctors are just winging it.
Yeah, they are.
Thank you. I've been summoned.
Okay, Rajani, I seen your hand, and can we have 3 minutes, so can we get the question out and get it answered in 3 minutes so that we can get it broken up for
We can do it.
Okay, go ahead, Rajani.
Sure. Feminist seems like a really white supremacist term to me sometimes, and I don't like to say it because it feels like I'm like just with white women.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you feel the same, and if there's a different term you'd like to use. Thanks.
Nice.
So there is the term womanist, but that is a Black term, and I do not feel comfortable using it for myself.
Right.
But I always say I support womanist circles. I use feminist for myself because I feel like that's, but I mean, the problem though, I feel like sometimes is like term creep, is like, at what point do we stop fighting for a term? And at what point do we give up on the term versus what do we say no, we fight for inclusion in the term. So I know that depends on the person, but I don't know if you've thoughts on that.
I don't like the word feminism, but for other reasons. I think the real feminists came way before my time. They did a great job, and that's why we're here today, and they deserve that term. And I also don't like when the term is used for some white women that sit behind a computer typing about feminism, and they call it feminism. So I prefer, even intersectionality, because it's such to me, intersectionality is something that colors your life experiences. So I much rather even go to that word, which is not also a favorite word, but I think any name, I'm more open than feminism, because I really don't feel that I was in the early fight for that, to be using that word.
Okay. And on that note, the panel has concluded.
Thank you.